אז ערב טוב לכולם, בוקר טוב
So good
וצהריים
evening,
טובים בחוף
everyone,
המערבי
and
וחוף
good
המזרחי, וערב
morning
טוב
and good
לישראל.
afternoon in the US and good evening in
נתחיל
Israel.
בסקירה
I'm going to
קצרה
start
למי
with
שלא
a brief
מכיר.
overview for those of you who don't know
אז שמי
us.
אופיר גוטלזון,
My name is
אחד
Ophir
מהיזמים והמקימים
Gutelzon.
של
I'm one
קבוצת
of the
ה-Unacceptable,
founders of
Saving
the
Israel Democracy,
Unacceptable Saving Israel Democracy
קבוצה
Group.
של ישראלים אמריקאים
It's a
ויהודים
group
אמריקאים
of
שפועלים
American
כבר
Jews,
5
Israeli
שנים עוד מעט
Americans
מאז
who
ימי
have been
בלפור,
operating for almost 5 years now, since
לשמור
the days of
ולעזור לשמור על
Balfour,
ישראל כיהודית
in order to
ודמוקרטית.
try and keep
בתקופה
Israel Jewish and
האחרונה,
democratic
וביתר שאת מאז אוקטובר
recently, and
7,
even more so since October
אנחנו
7th.
כמובן רואים את הדמוקרטיה
Of
במקביל
course,
לכל שאר הדברים
we've
שאנחנו
been seeing
קוראים
democracy in
דמוקרטיה
addition to
במגווננה.
everything else. We've
היום זה
seen
יום
a
קריטי
democracy on
שכל דין של
defense.
בג"ץ
Today
שידבר עליו,
was a critical day. It's the
אבל
discussion in the High
האתגרים
Court of
האלה רק
Justice, and we're going to
מסבירים
talk about it. But
כמה האחריות של
these
כולנו פה,
challenges
גם
just
בחו"ל
come to
וגם
show
בארץ,
to what
להשפיע
extent
עוד
our
יותר גדלה.
responsibility, both in the US and in
כמובן,
Israel, our
7
responsibility to make
לאוקטובר
an
הוא האסון
impact is
הגדול
even
ביותר בתולדות
greater. Of
מדינת
course, October
ישראל,
7th is the biggest
מה
disaster in the
שהוביל
history
למשבר
of the
מתמשך
state of
של
Israel,
החטופים
and this
בעזה,
has, and of course,
שבלתי
that
נתפס
led
מהם
to the ongoing
ש50 עדיין
crisis of the
שם,
hostages
מוות
in
של מאות
Gaza. And it's
חיילים,
quite
הרג של מאות חיילים,
inconceivable that 50 are
וגם
still there,
האסון
and
שהולך
the
ומתחולל
killing of
בעזה,
hundreds of soldiers, and of
שכמובן
course, the
יש לנו
terrible
אחריות לא
disaster
קטנה
in
בו,
Gaza.
במקביל לזה שהחמאס לא משחרר את העזתים מהסבל
We're
שלהם.
even, and of course, Hamas, which
ונוסף
is
לכל זה
not
כמובן
releasing
טרור
the
מתנחלים
Gazans from
וסיכול
their
דה פקטו של
suffering. And of
הגדה
course, there
ועוד
is the
ועוד ועוד.
terrorists,
ובשורה
the
התחתונה הכל
terror
מתחבר
acts of the
ביחד לזה
settlers. And
שהימין
bottom line,
המשיחי,
everything boils
הכהניסטי,
down to the
הביביסטי,
fact that
רואה
the
את התקופה
Kahanis
של נס.
Bibis, the Messianic
אז אנחנו
right
נמצאים
wing,
כרגע
is on the
בשלב
rise.
הסופי של הניסיון
So
הזה של
right
הימין
now,
הכהניסטי
this
להפוך את
is the
ישראל
final stage of
מדמוקרטיה
this attempt of
ליברלית
the
לתיאוקרטיה
Kahanist
משיחית,
right wing to turn
וזה לא
Israel from a
קורה רק מכוח
democracy to a
פנימי וכוח
messianic
בנייה,
theocracy. And it's
בעיקר
not just happening
מי
from
שמאזין
an
לנו
internal
בארצות
force.
הברית
And
ובשאר
I'm saying
העולם.
this especially
זה
to
קורה
our
הרבה
listeners from the
מתמיכה
US
חיצונית
and
של
from other
תורמים וגופים
countries. It
יהודים
happens with
ימניים
a lot of
בארצות הברית
external
וכוחות
help
אוונגליסטיים,
of donors,
ולכן
evangelists,
אנחנו
and
כיהודים
right-wing Jews in the
ליברליים בארצות
US. And this
הברית
is why
ובשאר
we as
העולם
liberal
חייבים
Jews in
להתאחד
the
ולהתעורר
US and
כנגד זה
elsewhere in the
ולפעול
world
יחד
must unite and
כדי
support
לבלום את
each other
המגמה הזאת
and act together in
ולהבטיח את
order to
ישראל
stop this trend, and in
כדמוקרטיה
order to
ליברלית.
make sure that Israel
אז
remains a liberal
באופן די
democracy.
נדיר אנחנו באמת
So
גם
quite
עושים את זה בעברית
rarely
וגם יש לנו
we're
קהל
doing this in
מאוד רחב גם
Hebrew,
בישראל
and
וגם
we have an
בארצות
extensive
הברית
audience, both from
והעולם.
Israel
אז
and
תסתכלו
from the
מצלמות,
US and
תראו
from other
איך זה
countries.
נראה
So you're
כשעובדים
welcome to
ביחד
open up your cameras
ומשפיעים.
and you can see what it looks like when
אז
we all work
אני
together to
מוסיף
make an
כרגע
impact.
למסך את
So now I'm
ענת
going to add
ודינה
Anat and
ואת
Dina
גבי אם
to this
הצטרפה,
screen,
תכף
and
נראה.
Gaby if she's joined us.
גבי פה.
Is Gaby here?
כן.
Gaby? Okay.
אוקיי, כולנו פה.
Okay
יופי.
then. So we're all here.
אז אני עושה אינטרודקשן קצר,
So I'm gonna
כי
do a
באמת זה ערב
brief
די
introduction
מעניין
because it's
ונדיר,
quite
שאנחנו
an
כולנו
interesting
ביחד.
and rare
הרעיון
evening.
זה
The fact
שאנחנו
that we're
נעבור
all here together. The idea is that we're
בין ענת
gonna
וגבי ודינה, ונשמע עדכון לגבי כל נושא
hear
שקשור
from
בדמוקרטיה
Anat and Gaby and Dina and hear
ובהידרדרות
about
שלה
topics that are
בישראל.
related to
אז רק
democracy and
פתיח
how it's
קצר, אבל
going
בטח
downhill in
מפספס
Israel.
המון.
And a
אז
brief
ענת
intro I'm
סרגוסטי
probably going to
היא
miss a lot, but
עיתונאית
still, Anat
ובימאית
Saragusti
דוקומנטרית
is a
ותיקה,
journalist and
שעומדת
a
בראש תחום חופש
documentary
העיתונות בארגון העיתונאים בישראל.
director, and she heads
היא
the
תפתח,
Free
אחרי
Press
זה נשמע
division
מגבי
of the
לסקי, שהיא
Israeli
עורכת דין לזכויות
Journalist
אדם, חברת
Association,
כנסת
and then we'll
לשעבר,
hear
ואחת
from Gaby
המובילות של
Lasky,
מערך
a former
העצורים
member Knesset, and she's
בישראל,
also an attorney
שפועל
advocating
לילות
human
כימים כדי
rights,
לאפשר את חופש המחאה
and she
בישראל.
works very hard in
ובסוף
order
נשמע
to
את דינה
ensure
זילבר,
the
שכבר
freedom to
שמענו
protest in
בעבר,
Israel. And then we'll hear from Dina
המשנה ליועץ המשפטי
Zilber, who is
לממשלה,
the former Deputy Attorney
שתנתח את
General, and
נושא
she
מה
will
שקרה היום
analyze what
בבג"ץ.
happened today in
אז
the High Court of Justice.
ענת, אנחנו נתחיל איתך, נשים
So,
אותך
Anat, we'll start with
אז קודם כל
you.
המון המון תודה שהצטרפתם.
So first of all,
זה
thank you for
סליחה,
joining
בטח גם
us.
חמקתם מאיזה אזעקה של חות'ים תוך
And I
כדי.
heard there was also a siren in Israel because
ואנחנו
of a
נתחיל
Houthi
ומהר
missile,
מאוד
and
לצלול
we'll
לעניינים,
start and then we'll
ותודה
quickly
לכל מי שעוזר לנו להפיק
get
את
on with
הדבר הזה
our
ולהגיע
business. And
אליו.
I'd like to thank all those who are helping us
ענת, הבמה
produce
שלך,
these
בוא נשמע קצת מה
events.
קורה
So
ברמת
the floor is
העיתונות.
yours, Anat. Let's hear a bit about what's the
תודה אופיר,
situation in
באמת
the
זה לא
press.
מובן מאליו,
Thank
ותודה
you,
לכל
Ophir. I mean, really, we don't take it for granted. I'd like to thank all those who have joined us this evening, and I'd like to also thank my fellow panelists. Such a
אז אני ענת
girl
סרגוסטי, כאמור,
power
אני
winning
עיתונאית
team. Anat
ועבדתי הרבה
Saragusti.
שנים
I'm a
בכל סוגי
journalist. I've been
התקשורת, גם
working
בטלוויזיה,
for
גם
many
ברדיו
years
וגם
now on
בעיתונות
TV, on
המודפסת
radio, and in
בזמנו.
the
הייתי
written
כמה שנים
press,
כתבת
printed
בעזה, אני
press,
מכירה את
and
עזה
I was
היטב.
a correspondent in Gaza
ובין
for several
המקימים של
years, so I
חדשות
know Gaza
12,
very well. One
והיו
of the
שם הרבה מאוד
founders of
שנים, וגם
Channel
הייתי
12
עורכת
News. I worked there
בכירה
for
של
many years, and
מהדורת
I was a
חדשות
senior
סוף שישי.
editor of
וכאמור,
the
בשנים האחרונות אני
Friday
רכזת
night
התחום
news
חופש העיתונות בארגון
editions, and
העיתונאים
I am in
והעיתונאיות.
charge of
זה
freedom of the
הארגון
press
הכי
in
גדול
the
בישראל
Journalists Association
שמייצג
in
את רוב
Hebrew. It's the largest
העיתונאים
organization in Israel representing
בכל כלי התקשורת,
most
עצמאיים
journalists in all media
ומאורגנים,
outlets, both
ואנחנו
organized and
ארגון גדול
independent.
וחזק.
We are a very large
ואני
and
רוצה רגע
strong
לדבר על
organization. And I would
מפת
like
התקשורת
to
בישראל, מן הסתם
I mean,
מוכרת
the
לישראלים,
media
למי
map in
שאינו
Israel
ישראלי אני
is
אגיד
quite familiar to
שבישראל יש
Israelis, but for those of you who are
5
not
ערוצי
from Israel, I can
טלוויזיה,
tell you that there are five
אחד מהם זה ערוץ
TV
טלוויזיה
channels. One of them
ציבורי,
is
2 מסחריים ועוד 2
public, two
ערוצי קייבל,
commercial, and two are
שיותר
cable
מיושרים לימין.
channels that are more
יש
aligned
כמה
to the
תחנות
right.
רדיו
There are several
ועיתונות
radio
פרטית
stations
מודפסת או עיתונות
and
אינטרנטית. זאת מפת
online
התקשורת באופן כללי, מפת
journalism
התקשורת
and
בישראל.
private
ואני רוצה
printed
רגע
press. So
לשרטט
that's
את
the map
תוכנית
of
העל מבית
the
היוצר של
media
ממשלת
market in Israel. And
ישראל
now I'd like to
להחליש
outline
את
the
התקשורת החופשית
program,
בישראל
the
ולדבר על
plan
כלים
of the Israeli
ממדיים
government to
שבאמצעותם
weaken free
מתקיימת
media,
התוכנית
free
הזאת.
press in
הממד
Israel, and to
הראשון, אתם
show
בטח
you
שמעתם
several
עליו, זה
dimensions
הממד
in which this is
החקיקתי.
happening. The
זאת
first
אומרת,
dimension, if
יש
you
בליץ
probably
של
heard about it,
הצעות
is the
חוק פרטיות
legislative aspect. There's
וממשלתיות,
a blitz of
שכל
private
הכוונה
and
שלהם היא גם
governmental
ליצור
bills, and
כאוס
their
בשוק
entire
התקשורת,
purpose is
אבל
to
בעיקר להחליש את
wreak
העיתונות
havoc, to create
הפרטית,
chaos
את
in
העיתונות
the
החופשית
press,
בישראל.
in the media market in
במרכז
Israel, but
הבליץ
to
חקיקה הזה
suffocate
עומד
mainly
תאגיד
free
השידור
media. At the
הציבורי, שהוא
center of
תאגיד
this blitz
חזק
is
מבחינת
the
החוזק
Israel
שהחוק
Broadcast
מגן עליו,
Authority, which is a very
שהוקם
strong one with respect to
ב-2017
the
תחת
protection
רשות
it
השידור
receives from the law. It
המנוחה.
was founded in
הוא גוף
2017
ציבורי
to replace
חזק
the old
שנהנה
Broadcast Authority. It's a very
מכספי
strong
ציבור,
public
כמו
organization
במודלים
benefiting from
האירופיים, לא
public
במודלים
funds, similar
האמריקאים,
to the European
ויש
model, not similar to
סדרה
the
של
American
חוקים
model. And
שנועדו
there
להחליש
are
אותם.
there's a series
החוק
of
האחרון, הצעת החוק
laws
האחרונה
that are
אושרה רק
intended
לפני
to weaken
יומיים
it. The
בוועדת
very
שרים
most
לחקיקה,
recent bill was
שנועדה
approved 2
בעצם
days ago
לסגור את
in
חטיבת
the Ministers'
החדשות של
Committee for
התאגיד,
Legislation, and the
כי
purpose was
למה
to
צריך
shut
חטיבת
down
חדשות
the
עצמאית
news
אם אנחנו לא
division of
יכולים
the
לשלוט
Broadcast
בה?
Authority. Because
מבית
why do we need
היוצר
an
של
independent
גלית
news
ישראל,
division if we
שר
cannot
התקשורת
control it? Just
שלמה
like one of the
קרעי
MKs said,
הודיע
Shlomo
כבר
Kari,
בתחילת
who is the
הקדנציה
Minister
שלו לפני
of
2.5 שהוא רוצה לעשות
Media and
רפורמה בשוק
Communications,
התקשורת,
said 2.5
וכמובן
years ago
שם
when he was
במוקד
elected that he'd
הרפורמה
like to
שלו את
reform the
תאגיד
media
השידור
market, and
הציבורי, הוא
at the top
מתנגח
of
בהם
his
כל הזמן,
agenda
הוא לא
is the
רוצה
Israel
שכספי
Broadcast
ציבור ילכו
Authority. Is
לציבור,
constantly,
הוא רוצה להסיט את
speaking
כספי
against
הציבור
them. He wants
לשוק
to
הפרטי.
shift
אז
the
זה
public funds that go to
אשכול
them
אחד של
and to
חקיקות
divert them
שנוגעות
to the private
לשידור
market. So
הציבורי.
these are
יש
the
בבליץ חקיקה הזאת
legislations
גם
pertaining
חקיקות
to public broadcast. In
שנועדו
addition to
ליצור
this blitz of
כאוס
bills, there are other
בטלוויזיה
bills intended
המסחרית.
to
הם רוצים
create
להשתלט על
chaos in commercial
ועדת
TV.
הרייטינג.
They want to take over
ועדת
the
המדרוג
rating committee, the
רייטינג זה
rating
בעצם המודל
committee. That's
שמאפשר את הנוסחה
actually the
שלפיה אפשר
model
לקנות
that allows
פרסומות
the
בערוצים מסחריים.
formula that helps
וברגע
buy
שהממשלה
commercials
משתלטת על זה,
in
בעצם
the commercial
הרעיון הוא
channels.
שהם
And
ייתנו
once the
יותר
police takes
הטבות לערוץ 14,
the government takes
זאת
over
אומרת
it, it means
שכספי
that they'll
ציבור
give
שהולכים
more perks to
לפרסום
Channel
ממשלתי
14.
ילכו
That
לערוץ
means that
14 ולא
public funds
לערוצים
that are
האחרים. זה מה
intended
שהם
for
רוצים
public
בעצם, ובאמצעות
advertisement will
השתלטות
go
על
to
ועדת
Channel
המדרוג.
14 instead of other channels.
אז
That's what
זה
they'll do by taking over
נושא
the
נוסף
rating
שנמצא בחקיקה
committee.
כרגע על
So that's
סדר היום.
another issue that's
ועל הדרך הם רוצים גם
on
את
the
האפשרות
agenda,
לסגור
and they
ערוצי
also
טלוויזיה, כמו שהם
want to
עשו
be able to shut down
לאלג'זירה,
TV channels
מה
just like
שנקרא חוק
they did to
אלג'זירה
Al
בטעות,
Jazeera.
אבל
We know we
בעצם
have the Al
כותרת החוק
Jazeera
היא
law. That's
לאפשר
their name, but
לממשלה
it's a
לסגור
mistaken
ערוץ
name. The
תקשורת
intention is
זר
to enable the government to
שפוגע
shut down a foreign
בביטחון של מדינת
news
ישראל. זו
channel
הגדרה
that
מאוד
is
מאוד
harming
רחבה,
Israel's
ובעצם
security. That's a
מאפשרת
very broad
לסגור
definition, and that
לכאורה
makes it
גם את
possible
שידורי
to
סקיי
allegedly
ניוז,
shut down,
CNN,
let's say,
BBC,
Sky News
ABC
broadcast,
וכל
CNN,
הערוצים האלה.
BBC,
כרגע
ABC, all
הממשלה
these
השתמשה
channels.
בכוח שלה
Right
כדי
now, the
לסגור את
government has
אל-ג'זירה
used
ועוד
its
ערוץ
power in
קטן
order
שמזוהה
to
עם
shut Al
חיזבאללה,
Jazeera down,
אל-מיאדין,
and
והם
another
רוצים בכוח
small
הזה
channel
לסגור
that's identified with
ערוצים
Hezbollah,
נוספים,
El
וזה
Mayadin,
מאוד
but they
מאוד
want to
מאוד
use this
מטריד.
power to shut
אז
down
זה
other
המימד
channels, and that's a great
הראשון
source of
בעצם, המימד
concern. So that's the
החקיקתי. המימד
first
השני שבו
aspect, the
הממשלה מנסה
legislative
להשתלט על
one.
התקשורת,
another aspect in which the government is trying to take over the media is through various political measures. The government imposed sanctions on Haaretz newspaper, and it recommended to director generals of government ministries not to advertise in Haaretz newspaper because it's too liberal, too critical, too left-wing, so much so that yesterday the mayor of Arad said that he won't allow the newspaper to be sold in Arad. Of course, that's an illegal measure that he has taken, but we can see how these recommendations are already taking form in the field. They call Haaretz terrorists, haters of Israel, traitors, etc. And I can tell you that we in the Association of Journalists, together, we've filed a petition to the High Court of Justice, and we're waiting for the discussion. There was an attempt for a hostile political takeover of Channel 13. They tried to appoint a politician, Yula Shamalov-Berkovich, who's the chief editor of the news, without she didn't even pass the minimal requirements to be a chief news editor of such an important news channel. We filed a petition to the High Court of Justice, and there was this campaign, and then the appointment was revoked, but it is constantly trying the government. And the third dimension, which I believe is of greatest concern, it's been going on for several years now. It's a smear campaign that's well funded and orchestrated. To a great extent, it's led by the prime minister and then trickles down, and that's a smear campaign in the social media networks. Let me just remind you that the prime minister hasn't given a journalistic interview in Hebrew for 3 years now. He speaks above the heads of the key media outlets. He is interviewed only in Channel 14. He gives endless interviews in English to foreign news channels from the whole world, but he refuses to speak in Hebrew to Israeli citizens in some kind of a media interview. He constantly posts on Facebook and other social media networks, and every opportunity he has, whenever he speaks with the Israeli people, he always slanders and insults the Israeli news channels. He calls them toxic channels. His supporters call these Al Jazeera channels to insinuate that they're involved in treason. His son calls Channel 12 and Channel 13 and Channel 11 news Al Jazeera channels. So it's a highly toxic environment that comes right from the Prime Minister's house. And the Prime Minister, in some very rare occasions, when he opens up his press conference to questions from the press, when true journalists ask him questions, he usually offends them, calls them liars, humiliates them, refuses to give matter-of-fact answers. And when we ask comments about pieces that have to do with them, they never give a proper answer. There's no other way to describe this but to delegitimize the media, to undermine the trust in the media, and that's through the social media networks. Now, I don't know if you know this or if you can monitor, the Prime Minister is sentenced exactly because of this kind of attempt to take over the narrative or positive coverage, and he's highly obsessive about that, and the circle of his supporters are constantly, engaged in that, how to undermine trust in press and media in Israel. We can look at the feed of the reporters, the correspondents covering Netanyahu's trial, and they suffer from very violent threats and bullying, and it's quite scary. And I believe and I see and I know that this creates a kind of self-censorship. This is something very difficult to quantify, so it's difficult to estimate the scope of this phenomena, but it leads to self-censorship and it deters journalists. And the last dimension is the one in the field. All this talk often culminate into these exhibitions of physical violence against journalists. We've seen this in the campaign against Iran, when various trolls or those who consider themselves as law enforcers, like the rapper The Shadow, they take it upon themselves to stop live broadcasts of journalists who do not speak Hebrew under this umbrella that they are making sure they are protecting the security of this country. They can be in charge of censorship. It has nothing to do with the official censorship. We have military censorship in Israel. That's not a very nice experience, but we are in a state of emergency since the establishment of the State of Israel. And every once in a while, the government exercises this state of emergency, and under this battle fog, there is this hunt after foreign journalists. The Hatzel, the shadow, he prevented journalists from entering a certain place and covering where a missile fell, and he made this separation between Israeli journalists and international journalists, and it's something that he just decided on his own, of course, under the auspices of a Homeland Security Minister, Ben Gvir, who gave him a certain umbrella. He designated him as a police volunteer, but there were other self-appointed roles who attacked journalists. We saw that live on TV. We'll soon kind of delve more into this, but you know what? Let me just say one more thing. Fear Israeli press is deterred, and it is, and we can definitely see in the sense that it doesn't cover what's happening in Gaza. You who are outside of Israel, you probably can see images of the atrocities committed by Israel in Gaza. There is huge devastation and killing, including in the humanitarian aid centers, and people in Israel can't see it, and I'm afraid to say that this is part of that self-censorship that is imposed by the Israeli media on itself because they are deterred. That's exactly the point that I wanted to use as a segue. All these points, you know, ultimately will connect all of them to the next elections campaign and what it looks like and the impact it has. And the next point we're going to go over, we're going to hear from Gaby. You're with us, right, Gaby? Yes, yes, I'm here.
ספוטלייט? מעולה.
So let's put you on spotlight.
אז גבי, את מה שנקרא
So you
בטרנצ'ס, בשוחות
are
יום
out there in the
עם
trenches
המפגינים,
day in, day
עם
out
האנשים
with
אחרים,
the
אבל בואי יותר
protesters and with
נדבר על
others.
מערך,
But
על
perhaps
הקונטקסט
if
של
we
מערך
could
העצורים,
talk about the
אבל קרה
context
משהו מאוד
of
משמעותי
the
אתמול, נכון,
detainees
בכנסת,
network, but something very significant
שבעצם
happened yesterday,
פעם
right?
ראשונה,
In the
או
Knesset,
ניסיון
it
ראשון
was the
שמצליח
first time or
להדיח
first
חבר
attempt
כנסת,
which
במקרה הזה
succeeded
איימן
to
עודה,
impeach a Knesset member, in this case, Ayman
מחד"ש-תע"ל.
Ude,
אז אני
from
רוצה שנדבר על הנושא
the
הזה ואיך הוא
Hadash-Tal party.
מתקשר
So I'd like to talk
בעצם
about that and how that is
לאינטימידיישן
connected to
שאנחנו
the
נחווה בבחירות האלה.
intimidation that we're going
אז
to
בואי קצת תגידי לי
experience
רקע
in
וגבי, והמון
this
המון תודה שהצטרפת.
election campaign. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for this entire event. Just like Anat said, such a female panel of excellence. It's a great honor to be part of it. Thank you so much for inviting me. Indeed, I'm an attorney focusing on human rights. I've been involved in this field for many years and one of the founders of Ma'arach HaAtzurim, the Detainees Network, and the CEO is here with us, Smadal and Ro'i, as you've said, and some of our people whom we represent, our brothers and sisters in the trenches. And I must say that right now, this is a very right-wing government, and actually there are three groups of three population groups that have an identity of interest, not just with the government, but each has its own unique interests. We have the Haredim, the Orthodox Jews, and one of their most important tenets is, non-conscription to the military, with everything that implies in the decisions of the Supreme Court that say that it's not a legal arrangement. We have the settlers and religious Zionism, and they are building illegal outposts and this insane violence in the territories, and they don't want a strong legal system, so nobody will stop them so that they can continue to break the law consistently, and we have the additional group who are the corrupt and those who support the corrupted, and I include the prime minister there and some of his supporters who are interested in weakening the court system in order to stop the trial, in order not to be prosecuted, etc. And then we have these groups that their different interests all lead us to one central thing, which is the weakening of the law enforcement mechanisms in Israel in order to advance their interests. And as they do that, they are weakening Israeli democracy. Anat talked about a very significant aspect of that. Dina will talk about some other aspects of weakening the democracy. And in January of 2023, the Minister of Justice of the State of Israel declared out in the open, I am now going to enact a regime overall. He called it by a different name, but this is what it is. And I would actually like to change the regime in Israel because it bothers us. And, you know, there were various arguments for that and fake news. One of the most significant things that we see, I can talk about it and soon I'll talk about Ayman, is that the prime minister appoints criminal who's been designated as a criminal to be in charge of law enforcement mechanisms in Israel. And that is so strange. And it has to do, it's also related to that person he wants to appoint as head of the Shin Bet or ISA. They're from the Scale School of Messianic Right. And they consider other laws to be above the law, whether it's the Torah, or like I said, the prime minister is more important than the law. And the minister of internal security, the first thing he wants to do is to change the police law in order to get more authority so that he can intervene in investigations and interrogations. This has been blocked by the High Court of Justice so far. And this is why they want to harm the High Court of Justice, so it won't be able to stop them. And yet, I must say that the police, in a certain way, the spirit of the minister has trickled into it. And we can tell you today that some of the police force is a political militia of the government, and it seeks not to protect and preserve the ability of citizens in the state of Israel to realize, to exercise their rights, but on the contrary, they think that their job is to protect the government from the citizens, protect from one of the most basic freedoms in a democratic regime, which is the freedom of expression and freedom of protest. Since the beginning of the protests, we have taken care of over 2,300 detainees. We can talk about use of illegal means for riot dispersal, whether it's the skunk, the horses, and other kinds of things, and overnight detentions and imprisonments as a form of punishment. And in recent days, we have witnessed phenomena of strip searching not in line with the law. Once again, as a mechanism, the police has certain powers and they are abusing that power, the search and arrest power, in order to deter and to try to get rid of the protest against the government. So what about the police? On the one hand, we see over-enforcement against the protesters. On the other hand, we see a lack or absence, complete absence of enforcement when we're talking about the settlers, the Jewish terrorists in the territories. And we have witnessed actual pogroms in the territories recently, this insane violence against Palestinians, against people from the left to go there to protect the sheep herders, but I guess that doesn't really bother anyone. And recently, I mean, only yesterday we saw that there was a fire. They burned down a military camp or certain sections of it, and some serious damage to soldiers. So now all of a sudden people are waking up. And the politicians from the right, it doesn't really make much of an impression on them, but really we're talking about a serious group of Jewish terrorism and of a form of government. And I'm going to say this very cautiously, that these are they actually are carrying out the plans of the government to deport, to get rid of the Palestinians from areas B and C, and they do so illegally. We have Smotrich that, in addition to his position as Minister of Finance, he's a minister in the Ministry of Security of Defense, so he's now giving legitimacy to crimes consistently and opening yet another front in the territories as well. And you know, there's also the issue of legislation. They're trying to say that you can't say the West Bank, you have to say Judea and Samaria. They even want to turn that into a law. There's this, you know, argument, what comes first, people's consciousness or the language? So they're trying to intervene in that as well, so that we won't be able to say the West Bank or the occupied territories. We'll have to say Judea and Samaria. So we are living at a time that even during the war, they are continuing with the regime overall, perhaps no longer with the basic laws like they did at the beginning, but there's a lot of private legislation. The legislation against the civil society is dramatic. There's legislation that says that all the donations to the civil society will be seriously taxed. They talked about 80%, and let's say people from the diaspora, Jews from the diaspora, want to give donations to the New Israel Fund and ACRI and to us, Ma'arach HaAtzurim, the Detainees Network, and we'll soon tell you where you can donate. But according to the bill, such donations will be taxed by the state by 80%. Another thing, organizations that much of their funds come from overseas won't be able to appeal to the court according to these laws. So they want to silence the ability of the civil society who receive donations from abroad, because we're not funded by the government like the right-wing organizations, cannot go to the court for some relief. And all that is happening as we're in the middle of the war. We're talking, it's not necessarily demonstrations against the government, it's demonstrations that are perceived by the government to be against the government. Let's say the protest for the release of the hostages. Since the war, there's been a protest for releasing the hostages and ending the war, and even these are considered by the regime as against it. And we have people from the families of the hostages who have been detained, and there's a tremendous incitement, and Anat talked about it. So it also focuses on some of the families who established, there's a group of families who started a forum and they're supporting Netanyahu, and there are other, and the violence in the social media networks against these families. We saw how the chairman of the Knesset threw Einat Zangalka out of the Knesset and some other crazy stuff that would be quite inconceivable. And it's part of this entire network of an almost tyrannical regime that won't have any criticism, not even by the families. So we work with the families and we represent them. Today we received a phone call that the demonstrations in Begin, you have that demonstration every day. So all of a sudden the police intervene. They don't want to allow people to demonstrate there in the middle of the week. So even the most, so let's talk for a second, but just about what happened in the Knesset. That's a new legislation as well. The fact that Knesset members that through a vast majority, the fact that Knesset members can, do something against the decision of the constituents who voted for a member Knesset. He didn't commit any crime. There wasn't any fraud case against him. That's inconceivable. So who's the first to be there? Not those who said that you need to throw a nuclear bomb on Gaza, not those who said that there is nobody innocent in Gaza, and not those who said that say that we need to kill people in Gaza. Those who call to commit war crimes. Ayman Oda, who represents the society who chose him, who voted for him, all of a sudden, Knesset members decided that he should be impeached from the Knesset. And the terrible problem is that certain sections of the opposition, they are sitting at a table where Baruch Marzel sits, and he was a student of Kahana, and they are voting along with the coalition for the impeachment of a Knesset member who's a true partner to peace, a true partner to shared civic society, and they vote to impeach him. That's a very black day for Israeli democracy, if we can even call it such. And let me just remind you that there are several indices or measures, parameters for democracy, and the most famous one is the DDAM from 1900. It's a Swedish index, and it has taken Israel down from the level of a liberal democracy to that of an electoral democracy. That means that the state of Israel is no longer a values-based democracy, but only a formal aspect of elections. And let me remind you that even in Assad's Syria, there were elections held. So we need to make sure or to notice that all these things are happening, and there are so many arenas simultaneously, and that's exactly the chaos theory, that we cannot focus only on one thing because there are countless processes that are happening simultaneously in order to exhaust people and harm democracy. If it's not through the basic laws, it could be through the police and the media and the civil society and the Knesset. And if they are doing something against a member of Knesset Uda, they're actually trying to harm the Arab society so that they won't come to vote. So we're in the middle of this chaos theory.
The shock doctrine ממש,
just like Naomi Klein wrote, and we're now in the middle of this, and this is why your support is so important to us, because you can go out and look at the entire process and help us focus on the war right now. We must bring back the 50 hostages home now, and we have to stop the killing and the deportation and occupation of Gaza, and we have to once again restructure Israel as a liberal democracy. Thank you so much. I reinforce everything you've said, and I have to say that, as Americans who experience this shock in the US, we see it on both sides. It's happening on both sides, and we have something to learn from both sides of the ocean. And now we'll move on to Dina. Let me just give some brief context. And today, after the petition to the High Court of Justice that seeks to appoint Major General David Zini as the director of the Shin Bet, and that was the instruction of the Prime Minister, but the Prime Minister is in a conflict of interest. And, we talked about the media, we talked about the police, and these are bricks that are falling of
בעצם
the
מדברים
wall
עכשיו
of
על ראש
Israeli
השב"כ, שהוא
democracy, and
בעצם
now we're
אולי
talking about
קצת
the
יותר יותר,
director of
מה
the
התפקיד שלו
Shin
מעבר
Bet. So maybe you could
לביטחון,
explain a bit more
נדבר
what
על
his
הנושא של
role
הרגולציה.
is
בוא
in
נשים את
addition
דינה
to
על ספוטלייט,
security with respect to democracy. So
ודינה,
let's put
שוב פעם
you
המון
on
תודה שמצאת זמן
the
להצטרף.
spotlight, Dina. Thank you so much for
היי,
finding the
ערב
time
טוב
to join
לכולם,
us.
וגם אני
Hi, good
כמובן
evening,
שמחה גם
everyone.
לקיים את
I'm, of
השיחה
course,
וגם
very happy
לשותפותיי
for this opportunity for
לפאנל.
the
הדבר שאני
conversation, and
פחות
I'm
שמחה
delighted
עליו
to
זה
have
באמת
such
התמונה
wonderful fellow
שעולה
panelists.
בהצטברות,
But
שהיא ככה
what I'm
נופלת
less happy
לשתינו
about, I mean,
חלקים
all
מאיזשהו
three of
פאזל.
us are parts
אז
of a
ככה לשמוע
puzzle.
כל אחת
So to
מהדוברות שקדמו
hear
לי
each one of the
בהכירי את הדברים
previous
שאני הולכת להגיד,
speakers and,
אז
from
בעצם זה
my
כמו ככה
acquaintance
לחבר
with what
חתיכות
I'm about
לפאזל,
to talk about, it's
שהתמונה
like piecing
שמצטיירת
together
בכל החתיכות
pieces of a
ביחד זה
puzzle,
תמונה
and
של
the
שקיעה נוגה
picture that
מאוד
comes up is
של
of
החברה
a very
הישראלית, כי צריך
sad
להבין מעבר לפרטים שכמובן הם מאוד מאוד
sun
משמעותיים,
sunsetting
עצם
on the
החיבור,
Israeli
כמו
society,
התחומים
because it's
שענת
important
דיברה
to
עליהם,
understand that there
ההקשר
are
של
certain, the things
הרדיפה
that
של
Anat
התקשורת,
talked about, the
צמצום
persecution of
מרחבי
the
חופש
media,
הביטוי, הנושאים שגבי
narrowing
דיברה
down
עליהם,
the
החברה
spaces of freedom of
האזרחית
expression, the topics that Gaby talked
והרדיפה
about,
בעצם
civil
של ארגוני
society,
חברה
and the
אזרחית שמהווים
persecution
בעצם את
of
האופוזיציה
members of the
האפקטיבית
civil
יותר
society,
בחברה הישראלית, ההתענות לחברה הערבית שהיא באה לידי ביטוי מאוד
also
מקומם
harassment
מבהיל
of
ומדאיג
the
בהקשר
Arab
של הניסיון התפילה של חבר
society.
הכנסת איימן עודה וההשלכות
For
שיש לזה
example, what
לקראת
just
מערכת
happened to
הבחירות
Ayman
הבאה, איזה
Uda
אפקט
and the
מצנן זה על החברה
ramifications
הערבית, איזה
that
אפקט
has
מצנן זה על
for the
סיכויי
next
השותפות
elections, what kind of an effect that
בארץ
could
הזאת,
have on the
והמסר
Arab
לגבי
community,
שוויון
on the
אזרחי,
chances
מה
for
זה אומר,
partnership in this
העניין
country. What
של
does that mean regarding civil
היחס למפגינים
equality
מצד
and the
השלטון,
treatment to protesters by the
המשטרה שהופכת
government and the
מרשות
police,
שאמורה
which
להבטיח
is
סדר ציבורי לרשות
changing,
שבעצם רואה
transforming from an
בחלק
authority that's
מהאזרחים
supposed to maintain public order to
ציבור
an
שיש
authority that
לסמן אותו
sees some of the people
ולפגוע
as
בו ולהצר את
people who
צעדיו,
need to
וציבור
be
שהוא חשוד,
targeted
כשבעצם כל
and
חטאו של הציבור
harmed.
הזה
And
הוא
the only
בעצם
sin of that
ברצון
group, of
להבטיח
that
את
population
דמותה
group, is
ועתידה
their
של מדינת
desire
ישראל
to ensure
כדמוקרטיה,
the image and future
פעילות
of the
שהיא
state of
לבטח
Israel as a
לגיטימית והיא מאפיין וסממן
democracy. And
מובהק
this
של
is very legitimate, this
מדינת חוק
desire.
מתוקנת
Definitely a clear
וכל שיבוש
cut sign
המערכות
of a
בזירה
civilized
הפוליטית.
country.
ומה שאני רוצה לדבר עליו
And
זה
what I would
בעצם
like to talk
שני
about
רכיבים
is
שמצטרפים
I'd like to
לאותו
talk
פאזל
about
עגום,
two
האחד
components
בהקשר
that
של
are also part of
המאבק
that
שמתנהל בין
sad
השלטון
puzzle. One
לייעוץ
is the
המשפטי לממשלה
struggle
בהקשר
between the
של
government
דרך
and the
המינוי של
Attorney
השב"כ ומה
General in
המשמעויות של
the
זה,
context of the appointment of
והרכיב
the
השני זה
director of
היחס
the
למערכת הייעוץ
ISA and the
המשפטי
significance of
לממשלה
that. And
עצמה,
number two
ששוב זה
is the
לא
treatment of
מאבק של
the
ארגונים לשמר את הכוח ואת העוצמה של
to the
עצמם,
government of
אלא
the
בעצם
Attorney General's office to the government. And
שתי
the thing
הזירות
is,
האלה שבהן
these
מתנהל
two
המאבק
arenas
הם בעצם
in which
זירות
the
שנועדו
battle is held, these are
להבטיח איזשהו
arenas
סוג של
that their
שמירת
purpose
סף,
was to guarantee
איזשהן
some
זירות
kind
שמבטיחות
of
בעצם את העיקרון שהוא העיקרון
gatekeeper
הבסיסי
arenas that
בדמוקרטיה, שכולם
guarantee
שווים
the
בפני
basic
החוק
principle of democracy,
ושלטון
that
החוק חל
everybody
על
is
כל
equal in the
האזרחים
face
שלה
of the
ולא
law
נוצר
and
משטר של
the rule of
פריבילגיות,
law applies to
של יש
everyone.
שווים ויש
But
שווים
once
יותר,
you have
של
this system of
אנשים
privileges, that there are
שמחוקקים
those who
חוקים
are
בשביל
worth and
כולם,
those who
אבל
are
הם
worth
עצמם
more,
פוטרים את
people
עצמם או
who
את
pass
המקורבים
laws that
שלהם
apply to
בבסיס
everyone,
פוליטי
but
מתחולת
they
החוקים
and their
האלה,
relatives are
זה בעצם
exempt from
סוף
these
תחושת
laws.
השוויון בפני
That's
החוק, זה משהו
the
שהוא
end of
מייצר
the feeling of equality in
ניכור
the eyes of the
ותחושת
law.
אי אמון
This
בשלטון,
creates
וכמובן
alienation and distrust in
וגם
the government, and of
פוגם
course,
בתחושת האזרחות השווה,
it's harmful to
וכמובן
the sense of
מייצר
equal
איזשהו סוג של ניכור
citizenship,
כלפי
and of
השלטון, אתה לא
course,
רוצה ולא
there's a
מאמין
certain
ולא
alienation to
רוצה
the
לקחת
media.
חלק
You
בחברה
don't want to
שבה
take
בעצם
part of a
הזכויות
society
והחובות שלך
in
נקבעות
which
לא
your
לפי
rights
אזרחות
and
שווה ולא
duties
באופן
are
שחל
determined not
בצורה
according to
רוחבית על
equal
כלל האזרחים,
citizenship,
אלא
or
לפי
not
מידת
in a way
הקרבה
that
שלך לשלטון
applies
או
to
מידת
all the
ההתנגדות
citizens,
שלך
but
אליו,
depending on how close you are to
וזה
the
לא,
government,
יש
or
לזה
to
שתי
how
פנים, זאת
much do
אומרת
you
גם העניין
object to it.
של
And this has two
זכויות יתר
aspects.
שמקבלות
First of
אוכלוסיות
all, the
מסוימות וגם
privileges
הסדר
given to
מחובות.
certain population
כמובן
groups,
כל
and
המאבק סביב
also
חוק
exemption from
ההשתמטות והעובדה
duties. And
שבעצם
you know this
גברים
entire fight
פטורים
over the conscription
מחובה כל כך
law
בסיסית
or draft evasion
שהתחדדה
law, the fact
בעקבות
that there's
7
such a huge
לאוקטובר,
sector
ההכרח
that's exempt from such a basic
בעיבוי
duty, and
שורות הצבא
it became more
והשלב
evident
שמנהל
how
בעצם השלטון
necessary the military is
להכביד
after October
בתולו על האוכלוסייה
7th, and
המשרתת ומצד שני
the government,
להמשיך
the
לשמן
regime is trying
בתקציבים
to make it
וכמובן
more
בעצם
difficult for
פטור
those
שהוא
who
הדבר
serve in
הבסיסי
the military, and
אוכלוסייה
to
אחרת,
give more
זו
perks
דוגמה
to
אחת, ודוגמה
another
אחרת זה
sector.
היחס
That's one example.
המחפיר
Another
כלפי האוכלוסייה
example
הערבית
is the terrible treatment to the Arab population, I mean, they are 20, that means that 20% of the citizens of this country are constantly considered to be suspects. They have to live up to these endless loyalty tests, to pass these endless loyalty tests, and that impacts their rights, their freedom of expression, their ability to demonstrate, their ability to vote and be voted. And these things will be even more apparent in the upcoming elections campaign. So, and now we get to the situation with the Shin Bet, the ISA, that the retirement of the previous director of the ISA was done, you know, on a very difficult background. It wasn't a regular finishing of his position, and it didn't happen immediately after October 7th. That's a different saga that could have justified, of course, finishing his term of office, but it's on the background of two investigations that are managed by the ISA, by the Shin Bet, that pertain to people closest to the prime minister. One investigation that has to do with leaking a classified document to the Bild newspaper in a way that impacted the hostage deal and the interest of the prime minister in the political arena. And the second investigation looks into the foreign impact of a terror supporting country and the fact that they funded people who work in the prime minister's office to a certain extent. The question is for how long and how much money, etc. And these investigations, their sensitivity pertains to the fact that the prime minister's office is the inner sanctum, you know, the core of a security secret, and most classified information goes through that office. And to think that any foreign entity, it could have been Switzerland, the US, England, any other foreign country, but definitely when we're talking about a country that's a terror supporter and which funded Hamas, that of course raises much greater concern. And this goes to the very root of national security. It's not some kind of a suspicion that can remain hovering above. This is something that needs to be looked into and verified. And when these interrogations started, very soon after that, all of a sudden, the prime minister lost his trust in the director of the ISA and fired him. There was a legal process that stopped this this laying off, and ultimately the prime minister decided on a certain date, and then the High Court, the Supreme Court, ruled that it was a starch conflict of interest that the prime minister operated in, trying to impeach the ISA, and the affidavits were submitted, both the prime minister and the director of the ISA, and the affidavits of the director of the ISA. He wrote there that there were several occasions in which he was asked to exercise the powers of the ISA, which are highly draconian, and I'll soon say something about that. This is a security organization that's supposed to combat threats of terrorism and any threat to national security, and for that purpose, they have some very invasive powers that could infringe on the civil liberties of people, to follow and monitor people, a violation of privacy, various investigation methods, some very dramatic means. And anyone who has these powers, obviously in a law-abiding country, is supposed to gear himself or herself to activity in line of the challenges determined by the law. And even in the ISA law, it says that it will operate in a certain way and it won't allow itself to be used for missions motivated from political interest. And the fact that it is determined by the law, it's not enough. Of course, you need to have people behind the wheel and in these positions, and that these will be people who will indeed accept that their power has to be reined in and harnessed, because if you have such dramatic powers that could impact the character of this country and to shift the country
לאורך השנים היו הרבה, לא מעט
Over
ביקורות
the
ביחס
years,
לאופן שבו שמפעיל את
there's been a
סמכויותיו,
lot of criticism
אבל
regarding the way the ISA
בסיסי, כמובן
exercises
שגם
its
היו
powers, but
מקרים של
basically,
תקלות
inherently, there
חמורות
were, of
שנחקרו,
course,
ובכלל
cases of
ההיסטוריה
serious
של
mishaps,
השב"כ,
and
לא נחזור
these
אותה
have been
עכשיו כפלשבק,
investigated.
אבל
And the
בעיניי זו
history of
דוגמה
the
לנקודה
ISA, and we're
שבה
not going to
בעצם
go back
שיש
to the story
קריסה
of Bus
ערכית
300. Whenever
בפעילותו של
there's a
ארגון כזה, זה
collapse
משהו
of
שהוא
values in the
לא
activity of such an
נשאר בגדרי
organization,
הארגון, אלא זה
this
משהו
is
שמשליך
something
על
that
פניה
doesn't
של
remain within the confines
מדינה
of that
שלמה ומקרין
organization, but
עשורים
it
קדימה.
can
אז זה מאוד מאוד
impact
חשוב
an entire
שהחינוך של
country
האנשים
and something
שמאיישים
that
את
is
התפקידים
carried out
האלה
for decades. So it's very, very
יהיה
important that
בהכללה
the
חינוך
people
שבעצם
who are the education
מדגיש את
of
חשיבות
people
ריסון
who
הכוח, את
staff
חשיבות
these
הפעולה
positions
בהתאם
will be
לחוק
highly
ולפיו, ואת
sensitive to the fact
הנקודה
that they
המרכזית
need
שאתה
to be
בתפקידים
law
האלה, זה
abiding.
נכון גם
And
לגבי
when you
המשטרה,
are
גם
in
לגבי
these
הייעוץ המשפטי
positions,
לממשלה, לגבי כל
it's
בעל סמכות שמפעיל את
true to
הסמכויות
any
שלו,
person of authority, for
הנאמנות
example, the
הראשונה
Attorney
במעלה היא
General, the
הנאמנות
first and
לחוק.
foremost loyalty
מתוך
should be
שהצעת החוק
loyalty
משקפת את
to
האינטרס
the
הציבורי
law,
ופעולה
out of
לטובת
the
כלל
understanding
אזרחי
that the law
המדינה
reflects the
ולא
public
לטובת
interest
אדם
and should
ספציפי
operate
כלשהו.
in
עכשיו
favor of
מרגע
all of the
אז
citizens and not in
במסגרת
favor
התפקיד
of
של ראש
somebody
השב"כ, אז
specific.
בעצם
And
הוא
as part of the
חשף
affidavit
שהוא
of the
התבקש
director of the
גם
ISA,
לחתום על
he
חוות
said
דעת
that he was
ביטחונית
asked
שלא
to
ברור על ידי מי
sign
חוברה
an
והובאה
expert,
לו
a
לצורך
security expert opinion
חתימה,
that
שזה
it's
דבר
not
כמובן שלא
known
מתקבל על הדעת, כן? כל בעל
who
סמכות
asked him to
סבור
do so. I
שצריך
mean,
לקבל
think
נייר
of any
חתום פה,
figure
פה
of
ופה,
authority who receives a
וכאילו
piece of paper and is
בעצם זה
asked to sign
התפרקות
here, there,
מהסמכויות
and
שלך,
there. That means
שהיו
you're
בקשות
shedding off
שנגעו
your powers. And
למשפט של
there
ראש
were certain
הממשלה עצמו,
requests
זאת אומרת
that
לתת
were
איזושהי חוות
that
דעת
pertain
ביטחונית
to the
שמונעת את קיום הדיון
trial of
במקום
the
כזה
prime
או אחר,
minister to
אולי
give
באופן
some kind of a
שבכלל
security expert
יסכל
opinion
את המשך
that
קידום
you
המשפט,
need
ועכשיו
to delay or postpone a
בשבועות
certain
שחלפו
hearing.
מאז
And
מתן
in the
אותו
weeks
תקציר,
that have
אנחנו
passed
רואים
since he gave that
שבשטח מה שקורה
affidavit,
זה
we
שבאמת
can see that what's
הדיונים
actually
האלה
happening
נדחים פעם
is
ועוד
that
פעם,
these hearings
וראש
are
השב"כ היה
rescheduled and
כנראה הדמות
postponed time and
הזכרה
again.
ביותר
So I
במסגרת
guess
פירמידת האנשים
the director
שביקשו
of the ISA
לפעול
was the most
לדחיית הדיונים
minor
באותו משפט. אם
figure
הגענו לנשיא
among
ארצות
those
הברית
who were asked
שמתבטא
to
בהקשר הזה,
operate to
מחכה לראות מי תהיה
postpone
הדמות הבאה
the court hearing. I mean,
שיגייסו
even the
לצורך
president of the US
דחיית
was
הדיונים,
enlisted
כי אין
to
לדברים
achieve
סוף
that. So I'm
גבול,
looking
והמילים
forward
לא
to
יעלה
see
על
who's
הדעת, הם
next,
מילים שכדאי
because the words
באמת למחוק
inconceivable,
מהלקסיקון
I think this
שלנו,
is
כי
a
הכל
term
כבר
that we can
עולה על הדעת.
completely strike out of our lexicon,
ובנוסף
because
לזה
by
היו גם
now
בקשות
everything is conceivable. And in
לא פחות
addition, there have been
מבהילות
some
להשתמש
other
בסמכויות
requests
השב"כ
just
כנגד
as
פעילי
scary
מחאה
to use the powers of the
מרכזיים
ISA
לצורך
against key protesters
רדיפה של
in order to
יריבים פוליטיים,
prosecute
הפעלת
political
סמכויות שב"כ כנגד
opponents,
יריבים פוליטיים, וכאן אנחנו כבר
to
באמת
use the
גולשים
powers of the
לדברים,
ISA
אנחנו לא רוצים להשוות את
against
עצמנו
political
למשטרים
opponents. And we always say we don't want
אפלים,
to
אבל
compare
זה בדיוק מה
ourselves
שקורה
to
במשטרים
some
אפלים,
dark, evil
כשארגון
regimes, but this is
שבעצם
what happens in these regimes
אמון
when an
על שמירת
organization
הביטחון הלאומי
that
בעצם
is
הופך
supposed to
להיות
protect
מארגון שיש
national
לו דפוס פעולה
security
ממלכתי לארגון
transitions
שהופך
from an
בעצם
organization
להיות
that
משטרה
operates for
חשאית
the good
לאיזושהי
of the
זרוע
state.
ציד
It turns
של
into some
שליט
kind of a
מסוים לחיסול
secret
חשבונות
police branch
פוליטיים
that
ואישיים,
hunts
וזה
down
באמת,
people
תמיד
to
אומרים
settle
אל
political
תאיימו
scores
בקץ
for the
הדמוקרטיה,
prime
וזה באמת,
minister. And,
כשדבר
people
כזה,
say
אם
don't
דבר כזה
threaten that this
חלילה
is the
יקרה,
end
זה
of
באמת יהיה קץ
democracy. But if
הדמוקרטיה,
something
כי
like
משנה
that,
את פניה
God
של
forbid,
המדינה
happens,
לחלוטין.
it will be
אז
indeed the end of
דינה,
זה
אני
democracy.
רוצה רגע למקד
Dina,
אני כבר
I
לקחת
would
את כאילו
like
לשלב
to
השאלה.
now ask a
אבל
question.
מה שבעצם אנחנו חווים עכשיו מעבר
So
לנושא
what
הזה, זה
we're
גם
now
את מי המועמד
experiencing,
הספציפי שנתניהו ביקש
also with respect to the
למנות
specific
ולעקוף בעצם
candidate that
את הסמכויות
Netanyahu had asked
שבג"ץ
to
ניסה.
appoint and to
אז אנחנו מדברים על אלוף
circumvent
דוד
the
זיני.
powers of the High Court of Justice. So we're talking
יש
about Major
סיבה
General
לחשוש מהמינוי הזה
David
מעבר
Zini.
לנושא של
Is there any reason to fear
מעבר
this
לנושא של
appointment in addition or
בעצם
beyond?
מעקף של ההחלטה של בית משפט בעצם, כי
The
יש
fact that
דיון
they
אחד שהוא
bypassed
הדיון
the
של
court's
constitutional
decision. I
crisis,
mean,
נכון? של
there's one
מה
discussion which is
שנקרא
about a
רשות אחת לא
constitutional
פונה לרשות שנייה,
crisis
לא מקיימת
that
מה שרשות שנייה מדברת, ויש את המועמד
one
הספציפי. איך
authority
הדברים האלה
doesn't
נראים לכם
carry
מתחברים
out
ואיך הם
the
יכולים
request of
להשפיע על
another.
הבחירות?
And there's
אז
also
אם להשוות את
the
זה
personal
לתחום
element. If we can
הרפואה, אז מדובר
compare it
באמת
to
בשבר
medicine,
מורכב. זאת אומרת,
it's
משהו
complex
שבאמת
fracture.
זה שבר על מכה, על
It's a
דלקת, ובעצם יש פה חיבור של כמה קומות
fracture
שכל
on a
אחד בעייתי בפני
bruise, on
עצמם.
an
הקומה הראשונה היא
inflammation.
בעצם
So there's one level, which is the fact that following this ruling issued following the termination of the previous ISA unlawfully, and the panel of judges said that the Prime Minister was in a conflict of interest, then instead of waiting for the Attorney General's instruction, who immediately after the ruling said, please wait and we'll give you the ground rules how to appoint a new ISA, he rushed to say the Prime Minister that he doesn't accept the ruling and he's going to appoint a director of the ISA, and he even named that specific person, Major General Zini, and that meant that they were ignoring the position of the Attorney General and the ruling of the High Court of Justice. And they have these technicalities that it was about the termination and not about the appointment, but the panel of judges said that the conflict of interest stems from the involvement of the ISA in regarding the involvement of Bibi in Qatargate, and therefore the attempt to say, yes, he did have a conflict of interest regarding the termination of the director of the ISA, but there's no conflict of interest regarding the appointment, so that's completely unfounded. So there's one level that the very bad personal and very highly uneducational and leadership example given by the Prime Minister to all the citizens of this country on how to respect the law. I mean, he is the head of an authority that guides the Knesset. So if you can violate laws, out in the open and even, post videos about that, why should, what kind of an example does he give people to abide by the law or respect the law? And if the Prime Minister doesn't respect the powers of other authorities, what respect can he expect to people have for his own decisions? So that's one problem. Another problem is the willingness of that candidate to be appointed in a way that is in contrast to the legal instruction. There's a certain ruling in Israel that the Attorney General is the authorized person to interpret the law. She said that what the Prime Minister proposed isn't legal, but we see a candidate who sees no problem in continuing on this path. Yesterday, there was an investigative report by Gaby. I'm addressing this very cautiously. Of course, I really respect him. He's a very respected journalist, but at least according to what's been published, he brought statements that Zini said allegedly that there's a legal dictatorship in Israel, and if there's a clash, we should always prefer the decisions of the Prime Minister over the law. So these are certain statements that indicate a very basic lack of understanding regarding to what extent the ISA is subordinate to the law, especially when one of the declared roles of the ISA is to guarantee the democratic orders of the regime in Israel. And as for the candidacy, it is the prerogative of the government. He's the Major General in the IDF, so he knows a lot about security issues, even though he's not a candidate coming from the ISA, and that's, part of the legitimate mandate of the government's policy. So I'm not getting into other questions pertaining to him. So what I'm saying is that I'm concerned also by the fact that he's willing to cooperate with an illegal appointment process. And, forget about the Attorney General, the Chief of General Staff himself also expressed his discontent regarding the fact that this was done behind his back. And if this candidacy right now, let me recap. Right now, we're at a situation that it was discussed in the High Court of Justice regarding the validity of the expert opinion of the Attorney General, who said what is the outline of an appointment which would dull the conflict of interest. At the end of the hearing, the judges sent the parties to see if they can reach some kind of an agreement by consensus, but if that is not achieved, then they will continue the discussion on Sunday according to the outline set by the Attorney General, and the power of appointment needs to be transferred from the Prime Minister to another minister, and he's supposed to start the process all over again to interview candidates, and then he needs to pass on this decision to a committee, the advisory committee, the Grunis committee, and she wrote that if at the end of the process the candidate that they'll decide to promote will be Major General Zini, then he will give a separate expert opinion regarding specific matters pertaining to that candidate, and this will bring up issues that were written about in the media, for example, that he was the candidate of the Prime Minister's wife for the Chief of General Staff, that his brother is employed by the Palek family, and they have close relations with the Netanyahu family. And these are issues that haven't come up yet. It's just based on what I read in the media. So you just need to see that, with everything I've said, as part of these pieces of the puzzle, there is the threat hovering over the impeachment of the Attorney General. She finished her Shiva. She will finish tomorrow or today. And, the government, with its famous courtesy and respect, rushed to announce that it will send to her the update regarding the date of her hearing. And they're supposed to discuss a bill on Sunday for the cancellation of the Grunis committee. That's, for not, it's way beyond 101. But you can say to their credit, quote unquote, that they're working very systematically and to close every crack. Hopefully, the opposition and civil society would have been able to act in such an efficient manner.
דינה, אני רוצה רגע,
Dina,
מנרי שתעלה גם את גבי וגם את
let's ask
ענת
Neri
לשיחה.
to
אנחנו
bring
עוד מעט
back
חורגים בזמן, אז אם יש לכם עוד כמה דקות
Gaby
אני ממש
and
אשמח.
Anat. We're a bit over time if you
ובעצם
have a few minutes
אנחנו,
left.
אם הכל
And,
הולך כמו שנתניהו מתכנן,
if everything
שלא יהיו
will
בחירות
go
בקרוב,
as
כן יהיו בחירות
Netanyahu
בקרוב,
plans, and
הייתי בעצם
whether or
רוצה
not there
לשאול
will
את
be
כל אחת
elections
מכם,
sometime soon,
מה
I'd like to
לדעתכן
ask each of you, what do you
הפעולה
think is
הכי משמעותית
the most
שהקהילה היהודית
significant
ליברלית והישראלית אמריקאית
action
וישראלית
that
בחו"ל
the Jewish
יכולות
liberal
לדעתכן לעשות
community
כדי
or
לחבר את הכוחות
Israelis
הליברליים
overseas can do
היהודים
in order to bring together
ביחד
the Jewish liberal
כדי להבטיח
forces
ניצחון
in order to
בבחירות,
guarantee a
שעוד פעם
victory
לא
in
קשור
the
למפלגה ספציפית,
elections,
אלא
and that
קשור למחנה
isn't
הליברלי
related to a
דמוקרטי,
specific party, but rather to the
ואיך
liberal
לדעתכם הייתם
democratic camp,
מציעות
and how
להשתתף במאבק הזה? אז אני אתחיל
would you
מענת,
suggest that
שאלה
people
משותפת
participate in the
וענתה
struggle? Let's
בטוח, אבל בואו
start
ניקח
with
שתי דקות
Anat.
וננסה
It's a
לענות עליהן.
complicated and long question, but
אז אני
let's
רגע
try
אדבר על
and answer
התקשורת
in 2
החופשית, אז
minutes.
אני
Okay, so I'll talk
לחבריי
about the free
הישראלים פה
press,
וגם לחברים
to my
האמריקאים, תעשו
Israeli
מנוי לעיתון.
friends and the Americans,
אני
to
חושבת שזו
subscribe
דרך
to a
לחזק את
newspaper.
התקשורת
I think
החופשית.
that's
הארץ
a
מופיע
way
גם
to
באנגלית,
strengthen
אז אפשר
free
לחזק
press.
את
You
עיתון
have
הארץ.
Haaretz in
אפשר
English,
לעשות
so
מנוי
you
לעיתונים
can
בישראל בעברית, זה דבר
strengthen
אחד.
Haaretz, and you can
הדבר
subscribe
השני זה
to
לפרגן לעיתונאים
newspapers in
שעושים
Israel in
עבודה
Hebrew.
עיתונאית ולחזק
And
אותם,
number two, to praise
ולנסות להגן
journalists
עליהם
who
מפני
do
מכונת
their
הרעל, זו
job
מכונה
and to
מאוד
try to
מאוד מאוד,
protect them
כמו
from the
שאמרתי, זו
poison
ביזנס
machine.
קשה,
Like I
לעתים
said,
ממומן
it's
ומאוד
a
מאוד מתוזמר
smear
ומאורגן,
campaign,
אז
very
לנסות
well
לייצר
funded,
עבורם
organized,
איזשהו
and
מגן
orchestrated.
אנושי,
So to
לפרגן
try
להם על
and create
דברים,
some kind of a
לשתף
human
דברים
shield for
שלהם.
them
והדבר
to share
השלישי
their stuff.
שהיהדות
And the third
האמריקאית יכולה
thing that
לעשות
American
זה
Jewry can
איכשהו
do
ליידע
is
עיתונאים
to
אמריקאים שמראיינים את
inform
ראש הממשלה על
American
הדברים האלה,
journalists
שישאלו אותו,
who interview
שיקשו
the
עליו
prime minister
קצת,
about
שלא
these
ייתנו לו
things, so
רעיונות
they
נורא
can
נורא
ask him
מפרגנים
the
שבהם הוא
difficult
יכול
questions, not
להתהלל
only praise and support him in
ולהתהדר
interviews,
בניצחונות
in these
המפוארים
interviews where he can
באיראן. אני
boast
שמה סימן
about
שאלה
his
שוב, כמו שדינה
glorious
אמרה, אין לי
victories in
מידע
Iran. I'm placing a question
מיד
mark on
ראשונה
that.
על מה
I have
שקרה שם
no
או לא קרה שם,
first-hand
אני לא רוצה להיכנס
information
לוויכוח
on what
בין
did or
טראמפ
didn't
לבין
happen there.
ניו
I
יורק
don't want
טיימס.
to get into that argument
אז
between
זה הדבר
Trump and the New
הנוסף.
York
והדבר
Times. So
האחרון זה
that's one more
כמובן,
thing. And one last thing,
כשמדברים על ערכים משותפים, אז
when
ערכים
we talk
משותפים
about
זה בדיוק
common values,
הדמוקרטיה
that's
המהותית,
exactly
וכמובן שתקשורת
the
חופשית זה אחד
essential
האדנים
democracy. And of
ואחד
course, a free press, that's
העמודים
one
הכי
of
חשובים
the cornerstones, one of the
בדמוקרטיה
most important
מהותית, כן,
cornerstones
כמו שגבי
of
אמרה
an
נכון,
essential
בחירות יש גם
democracy,
בסוריה,
just like Gaby
אבל
said
תקשורת חופשית
correctly.
אין במקומות
Elections, you had
האלה, אז
elections
כן,
in Syria, but what you
ובוודאי
don't have is
ובוודאי
a free press.
שחלק
And
או
definitely,
מרכיב או חלק
a
משמעותי בנוסחה של דמוקרטיה
significant
מהותית
component in the formula of an essential democracy is protecting minorities, and the Arab minority in Israel is under a massive attack. To say that there won't be elections, I'm not willing to say that, even though I'm usually very pessimistic. I'm not going to say that in order not to create a reality that would prove itself. We will have elections in Israel, and these elections have to be free. And I think that I would truly like to see American jury do that. Thank you.
גבי.
Thank you, Anat. Now, Gaby.
טוב, זה שאלה, כמו שאמרת, זו שאלה גדולה.
Well, like you said, it's a major question,
אבל קודם כל
and we
אני
don't
חייבת
have
לפרגן
a
להם,
lot of time.
Respectable.
First of all, I'd like
עושים
to
עבודה מדהימה בחו"ל, באמת,
praise Unexpectable. You're doing
אין מי
such an
שלא
amazing
שמע
job
ולא מכיר,
overseas.
ואני
I mean,
יודעת
I think
שגם
everybody's heard
נרדפתם
about you, and I
בחו"ל.
know that
זה
you've been
היד,
prosecuted
הזרוע הארוכה של
overseas.
השלטון הגיעה
It
עד
is the
אליכם,
long
אז
arm of
קודם כל
our
זה
government
כל
came
הכבוד,
all the way
מדהים.
over there. So thanks,
אבל אנחנו,
well
וזה גם
done,
קשור קצת למי
amazing.
האיש
And
שנתניהו
it's
רוצה
also
למנות
related to the
לראש השב"כ.
person
למה זה
that
חשוב? תשמעו,
Netanyahu wishes to
הציונות הדתית,
appoint as
בטח
the director of
הרב
the ISA. Why is that
האלוף זינה,
important? Religious Zionism, and
הוא
definitely the
הרב
rabbi of
טאו.
Major General
זה רב שכבר
Zini,
בעצם
that's Rav
הכריז
Tau, Rabbi
על
Tau, and he's already
כריתה,
declared
על סיום הקשר בין הציונות
the
החילונית
end
לבין
of
הציונות
the connection
הדתית.
between
כלומר, אם
secular
פעם
Zionism and
חשבו
religious
שזה
Zionism.
חשוב גם
So if in
לשמור
the
על
past they
הציונים
thought it's
החילונים כדי
important to
לבנות
hold on to
ארץ
the
וכולי, היום
secular
כבר הרב
Zionists
טאו
in
כבר
order to
אומר, לא
build this
צריך
country,
אותם,
now
הם בעצם
Rabbi Tau
הרודים,
says
אנחנו
we
רוצים
don't need
לייצר
them
מדינה שהיא
anymore.
אחרת.
We
אנחנו
want
רוצים
to
לייצר
create
משהו
a
אחר.
different
עכשיו,
country. We
בינינו,
want to
אם
create something
מדינת ישראל,
different.
כמו
Well,
שדוד
you know,
גרוסמן
if the
אומר,
state of Israel,
אם
just like
מדינת
David
ישראל תשנה
Grossman,
את
the
פניה
author
באופן
says, if
כזה,
the state of
אז
Israel
זה
will
ישנה
change
את מי
itself in
אנחנו
such a way,
ואת
it'll
השאלה
change
האם
who we
באמת זה מה
are.
שאנחנו
And the
רוצים והאם
question is this what we
האם
truly
בזה
want?
פיללנו.
And
לכן
is this what
המלחמה
we
של
hope for
יהדות
or prayed for?
התפוצות
So
יחד עם
the
המחנה
fight
הדמוקרטי
of
ליברלי
diaspora
בישראל
Jewry
זה
along with the liberal
זה אותו
democratic
מאבק.
camp in Israel,
אנחנו
it's the same
במאבק הזה ביחד.
struggle. We are in this
ממשי, אפשר
together.
לתמוך בחברה
In
האזרחית
practical terms, you
בישראל
can support a
בצורה
civil
בולטת.
society in
חייבים
Israel. You have
לכתוב
to
ולהתבטא ולא
write
להיות
and
ממלכתיים,
speak out
כן,
and
כי זה
not to
אחד
try and
אם
be,
אנחנו יודעים שיש לנו
too
ימין
PC.
וימין
If we
קיצוני
know that we
וימין
have the
אנטי-דמוקרטי
right, the
בישראל,
radical
הניסיון
anti-democratic
להתחבר
right in Israel,
אליהם,
the
לעשות איתם
attempt
עסקאות,
to
להיכנס לממשלות
cut
שלהם
deals with
וכל זה,
them, to be
זה
part
מה
of their
זה מה
governments and all
שמשאיר
that.
אותם.
This is
זה מה
what
שמאפשר
keeps
להם
them
לעשות את
in
כל מה שהם
power. This
עושים.
is what makes it
לכן
possible
להפסיק
for
עם
them to do
הממלכתיות,
everything that
להגיד
they
את
do. So
הדברים
to
as they
stop
are,
with all
כן?
the PC, to
ולהשפיע
just
מי
say things
שיכול
as they are,
גם
and to
על
make
המרכז
an
הפוליטי
impact
בישראל,
and to influence the
מבחוץ,
political center
כי
in
הם
Israel
נותנים
from the
יד
outside,
לפגיעה בדמוקרטיה.
because
זה לא
they are,
מספיק לצאת
aiding and
להפגנה ולדבר
abetting this
בהפגנות.
harm to
אם הם
democracy. It's
מרימים
not enough
יד
to go out to
ל-
demonstrations and speak.
לפגוע
If
או
they
להדיח את חבר
vote
הכנסת איימן
to
עודה
impeach
מהכנסת, הם
Knesset
בעצם
member
נותנים
Ayman Uda
יד
from the
להמשך
Knesset,
השלטון
they are
של
actually
הכהניזם
assisting or
והמשיחיזם,
aiding and
שזה
abetting the
הולך
continued
להוציא
regime
אותנו
of the Kahanists and the Messianics, and this
מהמשחק
is going
הדמוקרטי
to
בכלל,
take us completely
שלא
out of
נדבר על
the democratic game, not
הפגיעה
to
החמורה בשותפות
mention
היהודית
the
הערבית. לכן,
significant damage
לתמוך
to
בארגונים,
Jewish-Arab partnerships.
לכתוב
So to support
ולנסות
the
להשפיע בתוך
organizations, to
הקהילות
write and to try and
שלכם,
make an
גם כן
impact in
השפעה.
your own
הרי יש
communities.
השפעה הדדית, מה שקורה פה זה
There's
משפיע
this
עליכם, הרי
mutual
מה
influence.
שקורה
What happens here
במלחמה
influences
בעזה
you, and
יוצרת
what's happening in the war in
מציאות אצלכם גם,
Gaza, that
ולכן
creates
גם
a
אם אתם לא חיים
reality.
פה, אי אפשר
And
להגיד
so even
שאתם
if you
לא,
don't
אין
live
לכם,
here,
אתם
you
לא יכולים
can't
להתבטא.
say
זהו,
that
נגמרו
you
הימים האלה.
cannot,
זה
you're not
השפעה
allowed to speak.
הדדית,
These days
מה
are
שאנחנו
gone.
עושים פה
It's,
משפיע עליכם, מה שאתם עושים
reciprocal
שם משפיע
influence.
עלינו,
What we do here affects
ולכן
you, what you do there
חייבים
affects us.
להתבטא, לדבר,
So we have to speak
אני
out.
רואה שטראמפ
I can see that
רוצה
Trump
לסיים את המלחמה, צריכים
wants
לעזור
to
לו.
finish the war. We
עסקה
need to
עכשיו,
help him
לסיים את המלחמה.
deal now to put
זה
an
אחד
end to
הדברים
the
שאנחנו
war.
חייבים
I think this
לעשות,
is one of the
כי
things that
אני
we
כבר
have
רואה
to
את
do,
הדפוס
because
של
I can
נתניהו,
already see the
שיכול לדבר על זה
pattern
שבזמן
of
מלחמה אין
Netanyahu, who
בחירות,
could say that
אסור
you
לנו
can't
לתת
have
לו
elections during wartime.
שום
We cannot
תירוץ
give
למה
him
שהבחירות
any
לא יתקיימו,
excuse
ואם הם
for
לא
not
יתקיימו,
holding the
אז יהיה
elections,
מאבק
and
הרבה
if we
יותר
don't have elections, then the
רציני.
struggle will be
ודבר
much
אחרון
more
אני רוצה להגיד, אני
serious.
רוצה
And one
לסיים
last thing I'd like
באופטימיות.
to say, I'd
אני
like to
רוצה
actually end
להגיד
on an optimistic note. I'd
שההפיכה
like to
המשטרית,
say that
האמירה
the regime overall that what Levin said in January of 2023, this is what got this camp out of its standstill, out of its freeze. Now we have people who didn't define themselves as left or Zionist left, all of a sudden are defining themselves as liberal Democrats. We've created a much broader camp than what we had before, but rather the mindset of a camp, and through that we've created a political force that we haven't had in so long. So we need to aspire for elections as soon as possible and to reflect to all the partners of this camp that without a Jewish-Arab partnership, we cannot win the elections. So this is something else we have to do, but I'm optimistic despite that terrible difficulty in all the arenas, like I said earlier. We will manage, we will succeed only if we work together, but we will succeed. Okay. Next week, Netanyahu is supposed to land in DC, so we'll soon give you updates regarding our activities in DC, and hopefully they'll end the deal, bring back all the hostages now without any selection process. Dina, just a few last comments, and I'll share all the links that I shared on the chat in the summary, including the things that can be done. And let's let Dina conclude. And before everybody goes, once again, I'd like to thank Neri and Janet and Michal and Regina for interpreting. Thank you all very much, Dina. So a few concluding comments, and the main thing is don't despair of us, even though it's very, very difficult. People always say, if we won't, it's a pun in Hebrew, if we don't depend on each other, we'll hang by each other. We're one community, we're separated geographically, but we're connected. You know, we share the same values, and also in our desire to guarantee the best possible future. So we have to help each other out of the understanding that right now Israel, with all the crisis experienced by all liberal democracies, because of the fragility of the shell, because the fact that democracy here isn't that well founded, because of all the well-known reasons we're not going to get into right now, we are currently at this acute, very fragile junction. And in this context, I think that the help could come from this basic feeling of not giving up and being relentless. And I'm especially talking about the next generation, you know, the people who are on the Zoom, definitely their hearts are in the right place, but maybe their children feel more detached because of the good education you gave them, and because of the depth of the democratic values that are so deeply instilled in them, and Israel's conduct at this point, which isn't really aligned with that standard. And it's important to strengthen the connection of the next generation and their connection to the Israeli endeavor, out of the understanding that this is our, the homeland of all of us. And it's important that we have one national, free, democratic homeland, regardless of the question where people choose to spend their lives. That's one point. A second point, that's perhaps to enhance among the American people and the decision makers in the US to emphasize this battle that's occurring in Israel, and to make that distinction between the government and the Israeli people, their conduct and comments that are going more to authoritarian and messianic places. But it's important that people know that this doesn't necessarily reflect the Israeli mainstream, because such a broad population has a basis of common or shared values with the American democracy at its best. So it's important to convey this, that it's also good for the US government that we have a country that likes to tell itself that it's the only democracy in the Middle East, even if the democracy has become a bit blurred. So to strengthen this connection. And the third point is to truly support and strengthen the civil society organization in Israel, the protest, to donate to it, to strengthen it by giving a language, things that the level of their internalization in the American society, in the Jewish community, in the you some very clear things, and Gaby talked about it. There are words that are being deleted from our public dictionary, words like peace or left or freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and other words or terms that protest, that in and of itself has become a derogatory word. And because you are so advanced on these things and things that are very clear to you in Israel, we need to start to prove them in you. So to help us in this context of being proud of this language of rights, and also helping all the organizations in Israel that are trying to promote this. And I think that the most significant arena is that of civil society and the protest organizations, to help to work with them and collaborate with them. And I think that's an excellent example for leadership and inspiring leadership in the civil society. So well done. Thank you very much. Hopefully there will be many more like you. And thank you for participating in the Zoom. Check the news. We have no other democracy. It must remain in its place. Thank you so much. I'd like to clearly thank you for joining us. We're going to continue to fight to end the war, to bring back the hostages, to put an end to the innocent people in Gaza, and to work together in order to win the elections. And we have our work cut out for us. Let's keep in touch, all the people who were here, both in the panel and in the group, and we'll soon update you on what we're going to do next week. You are amazing. You guys feel unacceptable. You are truly amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was excellent. It's a source of inspiration. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
ביי.